Hola, mi gente, ¿cómo están? It is great to be back with you once again. Welcome to the Limbo Latino podcast. I'm your host, Joseph Colon. I am the Limbo Latino. I have a great show for you today. But before we do that, I want you to listen to possibly, hopefully, if you're a historian, you'll hear who this is and maybe have an inkling about who our guest is. So here we go.
We asked ourselves after the death of Julio, do we have to wait for number 2 or number 3 or number 5 or number 15 before we realize that that's all that this system has in store for us? So we felt now is the time for us to say exactly how we're going to respond to the killings of our people. We're not going to sit by and allow more Julios, right, and allow more Carmen Rodriguez abortion deaths. We have to begin to stand up as the people, the Puerto Rican people, and say that's enough. That's enough.
Enough is enough. Yes. So you'll get to meet the man, the myth, the legend, who is going to be joining us today. And I'll give you a little bit different of a flavor what we'll be doing today. But the show for you today, I can't begin to tell you how excited I am. But before we start, make sure that you hit subscribe, like, share, and comment on the podcast. And this episode will be featured in its entirety via video on YouTube. And so make sure that you subscribe there as well. So this podcast is dedicated to you, the viewers and the listeners, our history makers, past and present, and to those who sacrificed. This podcast was created to introduce and remind you of the beauty of our Latino X story and the value you hold, and ultimately to free frame our history to the masses and hear it from the movers and shakers, known and unknown. So today I decided to do something a little bit different, and I've invited a father and daughter duo to interview today. And we talked about this earlier. It is a first for them as well. So we are looking forward to this. So we'll be asking them questions about their experiences together and as individuals doing great work in the community and beyond. To talk about this storied history and futuristic goals and insights on the Latinx comunidad. Full disclosure, one of my guests used to be an intern of mine, so she is a complete rock star, and she's moved on to bigger and better things, and you'll hear from her and her story. And I've stayed in contact with her and seen her accomplishments and her growth, and so I'm so excited to see her follow in her parents' footsteps. So again, on this episode, I'm interviewing, drum roll please, celebrated author, journalist, activist, academic, and all-around amazing human being, Juan Gonzalez. And for over 30 years, he has had he's been the staff columnist for the New York Daily News, and he can be seen as co-host of the radio and television news program, Democracy Now! Hopefully I can do the intro for them in the future. He is a founding member of the Young Lords Party and also founded the National Congress for Puerto Rican Rights. And Juan also received accommodations and praises for his work and won awards like the Lifetime Achievement Awards from Hispanic Foundation, the National Council of La Raza, and the National Puerto Rican Coalition. He is a 2-time winner of the George Polk Award for commentary and was the first reporter in New York City to have exposed the health effects and cover-up by government officials surrounding the September 11th attacks. His daughter, Gabriela Gonzalez, is a second-generation American of Puerto Rican and Dominican descent. So she holds a BA in clinical psychology from CUNY Hunter College and is currently pursuing her master's in social work. Driven by her passion for child and adolescent mental health and values of anti-racism and decolonization, Gabby hopes to become a psychotherapist and practice therapy in service of social justice. And her work is inspired by the resilience of the communities that raised her, as you'll hear, as well as her parents who have supported her and who also organized teaching and literature, all these things that she's been able to come across as mechanisms for change. So it's with extreme pride that I welcome our familia, Juan and Gabriela Gonzalez, and I would like to welcome them to the show today. How is everyone doing?
Hello.
Hi, how's everyone out there?
Good. I know that was a long intro, but I wanted to make sure I provided you justice as friends of mine and family. Thank you so much for agreeing to be a part of this show. We look forward to kind of getting into the weeds, so to speak, and actually getting to know you better. So I like to start out by asking the question that I ask all my guests. And so I want you to tell us your story. What is your story? So I guess, ask Gabriela to maybe start us off, and then Juan, you can follow up afterwards.
Yeah, I feel weird starting off because I feel like my story is not as interesting or as long as my dad's. But I was born and raised in New York City, so right off the bat, when I think about formative experiences and things that have shaped me, like being a New Yorker is definitely one of them. I have so much pride, like for the city and the resilience that it breeds in its residents, for better or for worse. Born and raised in New York, have always had a very deep appreciation of people and like the human experience, which I think is so much tied to my parents and my upbringing, who were both in human services, teaching, reporting, lovers of reading and stories, and just all around amazing people. And yeah, I studied psychology as an undergrad, graduated last year. I'm now pursuing a master's in social work, which I love. And that's my story, hoping to be a therapist, as was said in my intro. But yeah.
Well, if I can just make one correction to your bio, Gabby, you were born in Scranton, Pennsylvania.
I don't claim that.
She was actually we were on a vacation in Pennsylvania, and her mother was pregnant at the time, and unexpectedly came early, and so Gabby ended up. We lived in New York City, but she was born in Scranton and spent a few weeks there as a preemie before we brought her back to New York City. Just wanted to set that record straight.
No judgment, right, Gabby?
You were raised in New York. You were raised in New York City.
I claim New York. I claim New York. I'll leave it at that.
Well, yes. Well, my story. Well, I was born in Puerto Rico, and I came at a very early age, just a few months old, when my parents came here after World War II, and I grew up in East Harlem and the East New York section of Brooklyn. Went to public schools in New York, and then also as an undergraduate went to Columbia University. And I was at the time, we're talking now in the early 60s, there were very, very few. This is before affirmative action, before any of this stuff. There were virtually no Latinos at Columbia at the time. I was on full scholarship, and you could have put all the Latinos in a phone booth. Back then, there were still phone booths. There were no phones, no smartphones back then, and so there were no organizations or anything. So it was a tough time at Columbia back then. And but for better or for worse, I ended up in my senior year involved in a big student rebellion, which was the Columbia Student Strike of 1968. Which was a massive strike. It got national attention against the war in Vietnam and against the racism of Columbia University that was trying to basically take over a big section of Morningside Park, a public park, to build a private gym for its wealthy students and its faculty. And so we had a huge strike. We ended up shutting down the university for 6 weeks. Hundreds of people were arrested. 700 just in one day, but there were probably more than 1,000 or 1,200 people in total arrested throughout the strike. And so that sort of awakened me to political involvement. And I got involved because I was part of a tutorial program that Columbia students had in a neighborhood just south of Columbia, and some of the parents there were involved in the fight against the gym. So I joined the parents in the fight against the gym, and we had a picket line really before the strike started. And there was this young African-American priest who saw a few of us students, and he said, "You guys come with me." So he had a collar on. We figured he knew what he was doing. And so he went onto the construction site of the gym and sat down in front of the bulldozers. And he told us, "Here, you all sit down next to me." So we all sat down next to him, and we all ended up getting arrested. So that was my first time being arrested in January of 1968, and then subsequently during the strike. So that's how I got politically active at first. And subsequent to that, I ended up being part of the group that formed the Young Lords in New York. with a tremendous group of really some of the best people of our generation, people like Felipe Luciano, Pablo Yoruba Guzman, David Perez, Denise Oliver, Iris Morales, Luis Garden Acosta. There's so many more tremendous people that all got together to form the Young Lords in New York, and was active in community struggles for many years. Subsequently, then after that, in the early 80s, I helped to found the National Congress for Puerto Rican Rights, and which was a national civil rights organization, and was its first president of the National Congress. But then I sort of went back into, at some point or other, after about 10 years of activism, I had to get a regular job, and so since I'd always been interested in journalism, I ended up going into journalism, worked as a reporter at the Philadelphia Daily News for about 9 years, and then moved back to New York and worked as a columnist at the New York Daily News for nearly 30 years. And in the process, I wrote a bunch of different books. I guess the best known one is Harvest of Empire, History of Latinos in America, which has also become was turned into a documentary film, and may soon be turned into a streaming TV series, from what I understand. But it's so I worked on a bunch of books and films, and then I sort of got involved in teaching as well. I had stints as a visiting professor at Brooklyn College, as a visiting professor at NYU, and for the last 6 years have been the Richard D. Hefner Professor of of Communications and Public Policy at Rutgers University, where I'm hoping to sort of teach the next generation of young investigative reporters about the best way to go after stories that make a difference in the world.
That is awesome. Gabby and I used to actually talk about what was it like being in your household. I could imagine what a fly on the wall would be to kind of see that, I guess, innovation, engagement, even the activism that goes in there. So, I kind of want to move it back to Gabby and say, Gabby, with all that said, your dad's obviously accomplished a lot. What was that like being a part of that, or being in the mix of it all?
I was always learning something. I remember our dinner table discussions were always very political, which is great, and I was always developed an appreciation of current events. I don't do it as much, but we always used to watch the news. It was just, we stayed up to date with what was going on, and just really cultivated a real awareness of current events, world events, national events, that I think I carried with me throughout school and still, have today. But if I had to sum it up, always learning.
That's awesome.
Well, I never tried to sort of involve Gabi in the stuff. I figured she would have to develop her own way in the world. But I remember, I think the most when I realized that she had been absorbing all this stuff was when she was in the 6th grade, I think it was, and she was in this school on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, the Columbia Secondary School for Math, Science, and Engineering, and there was a great principal, a Puerto Rican principal who was a marine biologist, who had started this school, brilliant guy, but then he got into some problems, and then the school district decided to fire him. And the next thing I had heard was that Gabi, as a 6th grader, had put a table in front of the administration offices and was collecting signatures of all the students demanding that the principal be reinstated. So she actually got started in activism at a much younger age than I did. I had to wait till I was in college. She was in 6th grade when she started getting understanding that the way you get things done is by organizing people to demand change.
Gabby, that should have been part of your interview process.
I didn't. That was I didn't even. It's funny because I didn't even conceptualize that as activism. And now thinking back on it, and I also will say, I cannot take credit for that fully. It was very much a class effort to organize. But yeah, like that was us kind of joining together around a common goal and really like fighting the system, I guess, as like 11-year-olds. So our 11-year-old understanding, we had buttons. It was a great effort. So yeah, thanks for thanks for defining that as activism, because I wouldn't have even thought about that.
Activism. Wow, it comes in all forms and shapes. So yeah, it's
Mm-hmm.
cool to kind of go back in the time and kind of your dad actually, highlighting that as kind of the budding, beginnings of your
Mm-hmm.
activism, or even just leadership. Really, to be honest with you, at it's being 6 years old. That's was it 6 years old or sixth
No,
grade?
sixth grade.
6th
11,
grade.
Yes.
sixth grade.
Okay,
Yeah,
6th grade. So that's amazing. If it had been 6 years old, I would have been like, whoa, wow,
yeah.
that's real activism. So Juan, just to kind of like bleed into that, how did you, as you were, walking through maybe even some charted unknown territory, how did you look at your leadership, as you kind of moved along in Young Lords and eventually, your career now, what is it about that, what did you learn, or maybe what did you tap into to really think about that leadership and activism kind of coinciding into what you're doing?
Well, one of the things that I've learned over the years, and I guess it began early on, but you when you're young, you can't really conceptualize or draw the lessons. It takes a while to be able to do that. But I think one of the things that I've learned is that a leader is somebody who, when everyone else in the group doesn't know what to do, says, "Let's try this." Let's do this. And because very often people confront situations where they really don't know what to do. And so someone has to step forward and risk being wrong, which I think is the most important thing that you learn, is that when you step out and you press for a particular point of view or a particular action, you could be wrong. And that's why most people don't want to do it. But that's one aspect of being a leader, is being willing to fail, being willing to take an action, get others to agree to do it, and then risk the possibility that you're wrong. But at the same time, I think it's also a question of coming up with a plan. Not only saying, "Hey, let's do this," but how are we going to do this? What steps do we take to get from A to B to C to the goal that we want? And I think that that's the other thing, is one, be willing to step forward and convince others that they need to do something, and then the success part is being able to figure out how to get there. So I think those are the things that I learned initially. I think to some degree through the Columbia strike, more so through the Lords. Because I think one of the important things that we learned in the Lords is that you don't need a whole lot of people to make big change, but you do need a group of people that are united and that are willing to uh, watch each other's back, stand up for each other, defend each other. And Felipe used to always say, our chairman in the Lords, he always used to say, "I'd rather have 5 or 10 people that are united than 100 people that don't know what they're doing or are disunited." So I think that that's the thing that I learned out of the Lords, is that you have to have, not only be willing to take chances and risks, but also have a strong group that you get together and that you keep together to accomplish your goals.
So in that vein, even thinking about what you just said, which is, how did you know what you were doing? And I love the fact that you said willing to put yourself out there and sacrifice and make mistakes and able to move change. But did you have any, I want to say elders, or as the young folks say, OGs, to help them kind of navigate the system or figure out some of the intricate parts of the activism?
Initially, not. I would say that when we were active in the strikes at Columbia, we really, I mean, there were old timers that were advising some of the folks who were involved in the Columbia strike, because of course we had a lot of figures who later became pretty well known. Of course, Mark Rudd was the big leader of Columbia SDS at the time, but there were other people that really played key pivotal roles. who at that time were basically, they looked to sort of what would be called the old left, a prior generation, for their guidance. But I didn't know any of those people, so I didn't take uh, uh, sort of counsel from them. But once we got into the Young Lords, we did find, because we were very much into not only defending the rights of Puerto Ricans here in the United States, but also of the island of Puerto Rico and of independence for Puerto Rico. We got a chance to travel and to visit Puerto Rico and talk to quite a few of the old nationalist party members. I mean, one of my big thrills back in the '60s was going to visit Blanca Canales, one of the leaders of the Nationalist Party uprising of 1950 after she'd gotten out of prison. Juan Jaca Hernandez, another member of the Nationalists. Don Jacinto Rivera, who was the president of the Nationalist Party after Don Pedro Albizu Campos died. And so we were able to talk to these old-time nationalists and learn from them. Just basically ask them questions. What did you do? How did you do it? How'd you make these decisions? And so that was very helpful in some degree. And of course, there were also, because the Lords worked very closely together with the Black Panther Party, and the Panther Party had a lot of sort of like a few activists who were young but older than us, Stokely Carmichael, Rap Brown, and we were able to learn from them as well. DC, Don Cox, one of the leaders of the Black Panther Party, and we learned from them as well in terms of how to resolve problems that we had within the organization, in terms between the organization and the police, between the organization, even in the community at times. So I think those were the folks that helped us, gave us directions.
So you talk about the collectivist approach, which is great. I mean, I think that is kind of almost in our DNA, right? Like, this is how we activate even our communities, and to kind of see working with the Black Panthers and seeing that model and kind of indoctrinating the thought process of working with the community and figuring out what's needed. Gabby, as you venture into this world of social work and supporting, what do you think about some of the nuggets of, what your dad just said, as far as what are you most excited about in this generation that will kind of tap into some of that idealism and kind of that push to make things happen in this social justice age?
Yeah, it's funny you say I jotted down half the things my dad just said, because I think there's nuggets of information that I want to take with me. But I think the biggest thing is that collectivism that you were just mentioning, and I found a lot of power in community. I think especially within the past year and a half, or I'd say even 2 years, with everything that's going on in the pandemic and transitioning into grad school, community has been everything. And I think there's so much that we can learn from the people around us. And there's one of my favorite Audre Lorde quotes, who I tell my dad constantly that he needs to read because she is amazing. But without community, there is no liberation. And that is one of her quotes. So I think I would say that there is a unlearning process happening in my generation about individualism and a lot of capitalist ideals that, my dad can probably attest to whether or not that was happening back when he was an activist, and I think it was, probably just looks different. And yeah, just the power of collectivism and coming together as a community and learning from each other and leaning on each other, versus this kind of very individualist approach to things. I don't know if that answered the question, but I'll leave it.
No, you did. You did.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think Gabi says something very important, which is getting support and sustenance from the community and the people. We always used to say, obviously, in the Lord's power to the people. We always said, when you have doubts, go ask the people. In fact, when we began our first big program in the Lord's, was what we used to call the garbage offensive, and we were meeting in groups trying to figure out those of us, because some of us had either dropped out of college or even dropped out of high school, and we were meeting on a weekly basis trying to figure out how do you organize the what issues do you organize the East Harlem, the El Barrio community around. And so we just decided to go out and talk to people. These days they would call it like a ascertainment or a focus group or whatever. But we just went out and started to talk to people on 111th Street and 112th Street and 10th Street in East Harlem and say, what do you think is the biggest problem in the neighborhood? And they kept telling us the garbage. And we said, what about control of this institution or control of that? No, they kept saying, no, there's too much garbage here. The sanitation department's not picking it up. They don't pick it up in this neighborhood like they pick it up downtown. And then they blame us because the streets are so dirty, but they never pick up the trash. So we decided, okay, well, if you're saying that that's the biggest issue, let's deal with that. And we started sweeping the streets. That was our first big activity as members of the Young Lords. We would gather on a Saturday or a Sunday, and we would get these big sanitation department brooms. We actually had to sort of like liberate the brooms. This was one of the days when Felipe shone. We went, a bunch of us, to the sanitation depot, New York City Sanitation Depot on 102nd Street and FDR Drive. It's right by the drive, and this big building where they used to keep all the supplies. And a few of us went in there, and we said, listen, we got this program. We're trying to sweep the streets. We need some of your big brooms, the kind that the sanitation men use. And there was this Italian guy. It was a Sunday, so there was hardly anybody in the depot. And there was this one big burly Italian guy. And he says, no, we're not giving you any brooms. You can't come in here and ask for brooms. And so Felipe got really angry. And he said, well, you MF, we're just going to take them. And he just pushed them aside and grabbed the brooms. So we all walked out with the brooms. So we then spent the rest of the day sweeping 110th Street and 111th Street and pouring out all the trash that was all over the place, that was overflowing from the cans into bags. And pretty soon we had accumulated 30, 40, 50 bags of trash. And so then we called the sanitation department. We said, there's all this trash over here at 111th and 3rd Avenue. Come pick it up. But they wouldn't pick it up. They didn't come. So then we said, okay, we're going to block 3rd Avenue. So we just took all the trash bags right at the intersection and blocked the entire avenue with trash so that no cars could come up and down the street. So then they came and picked it up. And so we ended up doing that weekend after weekend. And at a certain point, they got tired of picking it up and they wouldn't do it. So then we set fire to the trash bags. So then the sanitation men and the firemen came. And they cleaned up the trash. So that became known as the East Harlem Garbage Riots. And that was what made the Young Lords known at first. But it would never have happened had we not gone to the community first and said, what's the biggest problem that you have? And then we had to figure out how to solve it and how to address the problem, which is what we did by blocking the streets. So that's what we always depended on the community to sort of guide us, to let us know what they wanted us to do.
Yeah, and I think, it leads to the fact that you have to listen to the people, right? Especially those communities. They can't be just pushed aside or not listened to. And even something as, in our minds, taking the trash out or actually having a working sanitation department that actually is going into communities that should and deserve equitable means of support. They're not doing it. What do you do then? And so to be active in that way, like that was bold. Not to pivot, but I wanted to get your take on both of you. Like, what is social justice, especially now in this day and age with like the pandemic and, some of those things, but even, thinking about what is it that you see as possibly some of the issues that are propping themselves up, particularly, I talk about this show is called the Limbo Latino because we're living between two worlds, one being one foot in your cultural and prideful self. But then the other side is having to kind of work within systems within the U.S. and kind of figuring those pieces out. But what do you see the future of, activism? What does it look like, and what are some lessons learned that we could actually use to, innovate?
That's a big question. I think the first thing that comes to mind for me is, so I really, part of social work that really interests me is what happens on the micro level. So that's kind of the individual level, the family level, and in some ways also the community level, but I think the first two especially. And what I've noticed, and I think I was touching on a little before in terms of this unlearning that's happening in my generation, is really starting to question how we as a community, as a people, as a diaspora, can view ourselves outside of the lens of the oppressor, and kind of starting to discern, what aspects of our self-concept are tied to imperialism, colonialism, capitalism, all of the isms, and what is an authentic, what feels authentic to our people and our ancestry. And I think in that unlearning, there is so much power, because we break cycles of trauma, and we break cycles of trauma that then get passed down to leaders, that then shape leadership, and how we engage with systems. And I think ultimately, to create large scale change and create an equitable world, systems have to be abolished, be completely appalled, which I think is a lot of what the work that the Young Lords were doing, the Black Panthers were doing, Black Lives Matters are doing now, and criminal justice reform, abolition. But I think there's also so much work to be done at the individual level as well, in terms of that identity formation and a lot of unlearning.
Yeah, well, I would agree with Gabby on all of those things, but I would add a few others. First of all, I think it's very important for the current generation to study the history of the struggles for social justice and for anti-colonial struggle and for liberation. There's not a whole lot that's new under the sun. A lot of the battles that we're going through now are battles that generations before us went through as well. A lot of the debates that we're having now are debates that occurred before. A lot of the resistance movements that have arisen arose in similar forms in prior generations. And each of those generations had to come up with solutions. Some of the solutions were good and some were bad. That's the most important thing. You study history to find out the mistakes that were made in the past so that you don't repeat them again. And I think that, for instance, on the issue of the whole battle that's coming up, that has arisen in the past few years over racial injustice, over identity, and Gabby and I have had conversations about this now for several months now, back and forth on this issue. I believe that none of this is new. None of this is new. If you go back to when we were in the Young Lords in the 60s, we were talking about not only the need to combat racism, colonialism, but to also combat anti-Black prejudice within the Latino community. In fact, we were probably the first Latinx organization in American history to be led by Afro-Latinos and African Americans. Of the 6 members on our central committee, 3 of them were Afro-Boricuas: Felipe Luciano, Pablo Yoruba Guzman, Juan F. Ortiz. Right. 1 was African American, Denise Oliver, and 2 of us were what would be called light-skinned Latinos. So the majority of light-skinned Puerto Ricans, the majority of our leadership was Black. 25% of the entire membership of the Young Lords was either Afro-Boricua or African-American. And so we confronted the issue of racism within the Latino community, as well as racism in the broader society 50 years ago. And I identified it. There's one big difference for how we dealt with it and how, unfortunately, too many folks are dealing with it now. We did not see the racial prejudice within our ranks as a systemic problem. We saw it as everyone in a racist society is going to be inculcated with racism, right? And therefore, there is a difference between the individual prejudice and bias that is inculcated into some of us and the systemic structural issues that the system itself perpetuates. One is a contradiction among the people. The other is a contradiction with the system. And when you confuse the two, you end up fighting among ourselves over stuff that is not really central, because the central issues of the Latino community right now are housing, jobs, food, healthcare. It's not identity. It's not identity. It's being able to meet the basic needs of themselves and their children that will help them progress in the world. And when we get caught up in battles over identity, rather than understand that the struggle has to be to change the structures of the system, we end up being lost and easily being co-opted. At every university in America today, every major leader from the president on down is talking about DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. They're all throwing millions of dollars into new programs to research racial justice. Meanwhile, the universities are happily performing their capitalist neoliberal function while they study racism, while they throw money at research. They're continuing to gentrify the communities around them. They're continuing to service the needs of a neoliberal state, and they're not structurally changing. So what they're doing is they're buying off the most active faculty with new grants, with promotions, with everything else. So are the foundations, so are the corporations. All you got to do is look at the National Basketball Association. The day they put Black Lives Matter, painted it on their basketball courts, these are owners that are racist to the core, who are capitalists to the core, who understand that their market is changing. The demographics of their market is changing, so they have to placate the market by appearing to be enlightened, while meanwhile, they're continuing to exploit the communities. So, we have to be careful not to buy into the co-optation that is occurring over racial justice in America today, at the corporate level, at the university level, at every level. We have to say, yes, we have problems in our own communities, but the system is the problem. And we got to continue to keep our focus on the system and change the system.
Wow. That I know, right, Gabby? That's a lot. I mean, one of the things that, you both of you really highlighted is this whole idea of the kind of like the connected struggle, particularly around Black and Latinos. And I think, as I recall, I've had conversations with students. I've had conversations with some of my friends and family members about what is the divide between this, like this idea that they're so much far apart in their struggles and in their social justice amplification of how do we get here? And, a lot of the conversation surrounds itself, we joke around about this whole idea about who's the largest minority, right? Minoritized group in the US. Well, what does that mean? Does that mean that you get the most crumbs? Do you get the best services? Are you having more political clout? And so, as you think about kind of the struggles and the connections there, what do you think would be some ways in which we could really connect the dots for particularly Black and Latino Latinx community, so that way we can actually not start from scratch, but also, like you said, go back into history. It's very cyclical in a sense, but how do we fast forward the education and how do we get people to understand that together, that collectivist nature could actually do more good for our communities quicker, faster, and politically have a hand in moving the dial faster?
Well, I think we have to constantly urge unity. That's the key thing. Unite people who are oppressed in any manner. And not get into this relative. Well, who's more oppressed? Who suffered the most? It's and because that's not the issue. There are pro-exploitation people in all races and nationalities, right? Or it's not talking about anti-colonialism. One of the big problems in the anti-colonial struggle was the development of new ruling classes, whether it's in Ghana or Nigeria or Zimbabwe or Jamaica or in Venezuela or Brazil or El Salvador. Each of these countries has exploitative people of their own nationality and race that are benefiting from a system, a worldwide system, so that we cannot see the problem strictly in racial and ethnic terms. We have to understand the class nature of the system, and yes, there are relative degrees of more crumbs or less crumbs. The power of Occupy Wall Street is that Occupy Wall Street had a simple slogan, right? We are the 99%, right? We are the 99%. That's the most unifying slogan you can come up with, because there are very few people in the 1%. You could even get down now to the 1/100th of 1%. When you realize that everyone to some degree or other is hurt by the system as it exists today, and Gabby's emphasis on mental health is so important. And I mean, we have a mental health crisis of immense proportions in America. When we were in the Young Lords, there was a heroin epidemic in the country, and people were, targeting the Black and Latino communities because we were involved in heroin, and we had a whole detox program in the Lords to try to get some of our members off of heroin. Do you know that in 1973, at the height of the heroin epidemic in America, 7,000 people died of heroin overdoses? I mean, died of drug overdoses in the United States. 7,000 of drug overdoses. In the 80s, at the height of the crack cocaine epidemic, when crack cocaine became sort of like a symbol of the dysfunction of the Black and Latino communities, supposedly, and that helped to spur the entire prison industrial complex we have today. At the height of the crack cocaine epidemic, there were 14,000 overdose deaths in the United States. Last year, 100,000 people died of drug overdoses in the United States of America. 10 times what happened during the heroin epidemic or the crack cocaine epidemic. 100,000 people. That is a symbol of a country with major mental health problems, that so many Americans have to take opioids to help them deal with their situation. And no one is saying lock them all up now, because most of the people on opioids are white, and no one is saying, oh, throw the book at them, 3 strikes and you're out. No, they're all saying, let's help, let's figure out, if you have a problem, call this number. So it's a whole different attitude, but yet the problem is much, much worse now than it was back then. So, what I'm saying is that we've got to get a better sense of, there's a lot of people suffering in America because of the system as the way it's developed. And we cannot try to get into our silos of this ethnic group or that racial group. Yes, some people have definitely suffered more and need and reparations and reallocation of resources has to be done. But we can't forget the fact that we need everybody united to be able to affect real systemic change.
Yeah, I mean, touching upon the mental health piece, and also the inequities around drug abuse, and that there are connections there. And like you said, there's a connection with class, and not just race and ethnicity, but class, socioeconomics. All these layers seem to be compounded, and they all deal differently based on communities that are affected mostly, or in the spotlight per se. Um, Seeming that you're going into the social work and mental health area, this is your focus, Gabby.
Mhm.
What's the silver lining? What do you think are some ways in which we are kind of either turning the corner, or even thinking about how we talk about mental health in the community, particularly Latino or BIPOC community?
Mhm. Yeah, and before we go into that, and I'll try and make it pretty and circle back to the original question. But I also did, in terms of kind of the differences between like what Black activism and Latinx activism looks like, and it's we also have to acknowledge the overlaps between those two communities, right? And the fact that there are many Black Latinos. Like, I myself identify as an Afro Latina. My mother is a Black Dominican. So it's also, I think, and that ties into what I think. I'm not going to say that this wasn't happening in the 60s, because again, as we discussed, it was. But a lot of, I think, people my age are starting to like reconcile that history and be like, okay, like we were taught again by colonizing powers to negate our Blackness and like to reclaim that, and that reclaiming process then paves the way for more unified like activist agendas. And in terms of mental health, I think very similarly, there are a lot more like candid discussions around mental health that are happening within the diaspora. And I think a lot more people are willing to talk about their feelings and the ways that, poverty is trauma, acculturation, assimilation is trauma, and having to like losing a language, right? After immigrating, and like losing touch with indigenous lands, right? Like, and the overlaps with indigenous communities and Latino communities. So I think there is a lot of talk around how all of those systems, forces, movements have affected us, not just like as individuals today, but have also affected us for generations, right? And how we're carrying that with us still in our bodies. And yeah, it's amazing to see that those discussions are happening. And while I definitely have started to like, again, my dad talked about like identity formation a lot, but even though it's so important to focus on the ways that the systems are hurting us and unify against system and separate it from the individual, systems are maintained by people, and people are in positions of power, and those people in those positions have potential to do more harm if they're not thinking about their privileges and their positionalities and the ways that their communities have interacted with power. So yeah, that's what
I'm very hopeful, to be honest with you. I have to say, the young folks that I come across, they seem to have much more sophisticated understanding about what their world looks like these days. And, growing up myself, I'm Generation X, so I grew up during that crack epidemic. I saw all types of things happen in my Brooklyn neighborhood. I lived in Fort Greene, pre-gentrified Fort Greene. So let me just make sure I put that out there. It's kind of a Gabby's mode of conduct of where I was born versus where I'm at.
yeah.
But in all honesty, one of the things that I really am hopeful for is that this generation is very, very well versed, not only in the terminology, but the pandemic allowed you to actually engage differently, and it also stifled some of that in-person, to some degree, engagement of activism that really is. I'm hopeful that it will continue on to be able to be a part of your identity in a sense, and part of the values that you espouse in that. As you get older, they'll continue. So not to kind of pivot, but I wanted to know, people always ask, how do I get involved? What should I be doing? You all talked about kind of diving deep into history. So what do you do on a consistent basis, or what are your recommendations, or even books, articles, podcasts, things that you are really, engrossed in, to kind of keep yourselves abreast of what's happening right now? I know that, I've had conversations with Felipe before, and he does this whole quiz, and he basically quizzes you on the whole diaspora, which can be daunting. That's a full day exercise. But how do you all, and what are recommendations, especially around the Latinx community, to kind of really think about the issues in its current state?
Recommendations in terms of books or articles, or
Yeah, books, articles, or even, maybe just highlighting maybe the international and global, issues that are happening that people may not know about.
well, I think in terms of domestically, some of the sites that are really doing pretty good work is I don't know how many people are familiar with Latino Rebels, the website. They're really on top of a lot of the information and news that's happening that affects the Latino community. There's also of course, Maria Hinojosa's Latino USA is still doing a good job, but it's more of a magazine format. In terms of international stuff, I'd say we in Democracy Now! Probably have more stuff on what's happening in Latin America and the Caribbean than any other news program, commercial or non-commercial, in the country. So that's always a good source. And uh, and then in terms of books, I mean, one of the things that I'm most concerned about in terms of the social movement, and that I've been trying to get my students in journalism and media studies to grasp, is that no matter what we are doing in the social movements, the society, US society, and most advanced capitalist countries have developed the most sophisticated instruments of totalitarian control that we have ever had in history. It is very simple. If any fascist comes to power in the United States, to control the population right now, because we are all being surveilled on a minute by minute daily basis by our use of digital technology. And for that, I would recommend, and I've recommended it to Gabby, and I recommend it to all my students. You must read Shoshona Zubin's The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. It is an eye-opening book about how the major technological companies of the world are mining our human experience. It is no longer just a question of selling you goods. It is knowing what you are thinking about, and by tracking your footprints on the web, and knowing what you are going to want. And the mining of human experience is an entire whole new realm of exploitation. And it doesn't matter what nationality or race you are, if you're not clear on what's happening, you're not going to be able to deal with uh, with the 21st century nature of exploitation and oppression. So I think that to me is critical. And Shoshona Zubin's Age of Surveillance Capitalism. It's a must read, I think. Uh, and of course, reading histories. I mean, I believe it's really important to read histories, and to be able to get a sense of what movements have occurred before we were here.
Yes to all of that. I was gonna say Democracy Now! As well. I started watching it again. I don't know if my dad knows this, but I'm watching it more regularly now, because I had stopped. But definitely Democracy Now! For current events. I'm a huge reader, so I have a list of books. I think around identity and kind of grappling with, between two worlds. I recently read this book called For Brown Girls with Sharp Edges and Tender Hearts by Priscilla Rodriguez, who actually also has an Instagram page called Latina Rebels. So not Latino Rebels, but I imagine it's inspired by that website, where she, posts a lot of current events and a lot of political commentary, usually centered around the Latina or like female presenting Latinx experience. And that book is phenomenal. I think it does a really good job at capturing a lot of the main kind of points in identity. And another book from the mental health perspective, it's not a Latinx exclusive perspective, but I think it's applicable. It's called My Grandmother's Hands, Racialized Trauma and the Pathway to Mending Our Hearts and Bodies by Reza Menachem. And it discusses kind of what I was talking about before and kind of the ways that all of these isms, racism, slavery, colonialism are all forms of trauma, and how we today, like that has actually impacted our nervous systems and is affecting the ways that we show up in the world. So that's a really interesting read. What else? I think also just to tie this all back to what we were talking about in the beginning, engaging with the community, with people. That's been one of my most fulfilling aspects of being a social worker in training, is just getting to sit with people's stories. And I think I've said this to my dad, but if not, he's going to hear this. It's been such a privilege to be able to learn from him, and I feel like every time that I, hear nuggets of his work in the Lords, of his reporting, I just learn so much more about the world and about what's been done, about what the struggle has been, what the focus against the struggle today should be. So sit with the community, sit with your families, ask questions from your elders, and really just, sit with those stories and those experiences. Because at the end of the day, like that is, I think, the best way to learn and get involved and be inspired to continue creating change in like their name and like to honor them. So
Agreed. I think I spent during the holidays, I was actually cleaning and found a couple of things that I had not seen in years, and it just reminded me about my, not just my ancestors, but my family. And to think about the pandemic kind of ripping you away for 2 years almost, and not being able to engage that as authentically, or even taking it for granted, it really puts a lot of perspective. So we're at the end of the show, and I wanted to give you back the spotlight and ask you, what are some parting words of wisdom, or maybe, what are some sayings in which you would like to leave this familia kind of thinking about after our discussion? What are some things that maybe weren't said yet, and maybe you want to make sure that you get the last word? So what are some things that you'd like to leave the audience?
Well, I would just say, especially given the fact that we've been going through this pandemic now, we're entering our third year very soon on this, is that especially for young people, it may seem like this is really defining their lives and limiting them and making it so much difficult for them. But life isn't always easy, and you've got to, even in the worst crises, you have to remind yourself, this too shall pass. This at some point it will end. Now the problem is that life will never be the same like it was before. So it is one of these moments in history that changes the nature of how we move and how we perceive the world. But it will pass, and the most important thing to do is to not give up. To keep moving forward, to keep struggling, to keep your loved ones close, and not lose hope. I think that's the most important thing. Never lose hope.
Gabby?
My dog decided to just start barking, so if you hear her in the background, I apologize. But I think very similarly to that, just take time to sit with yourself. And I really wanted to echo the point of sitting with your elders, sitting with community, investing in community. Because again, to say the quote from Audre Lorde that I love so much, there really is no liberation without community. So just investing in that where you can, and however you can in the middle of a pandemic, which I know is hard.
Awesome. Well, I want to, from the bottom of my heart, thank you both for joining me and spending time with us and myself, especially. I've missed you all terribly. And so it's just great to see you, even if it was virtual, to continue having these thoughtful conversations. And again, for folks who maybe want to follow you, obviously Democracy Now, right? And any other social media y'all want to plug as far as things that you're a part of, maybe maybe hashtag, I don't know what the young folks talk about these days, but Instagram, follow these folks. So if there's anything, just make sure that you continue the conversation. Again, thank you so much. I'm highly appreciative. This is the Limbo Latino podcast, and my guests, Juan Gonzalez and Gabriela Gonzalez, thank you once again.
Okay, thank you for bringing us together.
Yeah, this has been fun.